It seems as though it's unending COVID lockdowns until the vaccines arrive. But will people take them when the vaccines get here? Joe Biden, meanwhile, pleases some and upsets others as he gears up for action on climate change and for once attempts to cancel both the living and the dead fail miserably. My name's Mallen Baker, this is the Mallen Baker Show. This week we discovered what will happen in the UK after the current period of lockdown is over. Because we'd been told to rejoice. Lockdown would not be renewed after December the 2nd. Instead, we would move back to a tiered system. Tiers turn out to be the operative word, because most of the country gets thrown into a strengthened tier 2 or tier 3 that isn't that different to lockdown. We will be allowed to have a more normal Christmas, apparently. But the process of infantilizing the population doesn't end there. Keep your windows open over Christmas, say experts. Really? Can we get a report on how many of those experts practice what they preach come Christmas? Even though it won't be illegal, don't hug Granny, even if she's freezing because the bloody window's open. Of course, Christmas is probably the reason why almost every part of the country, regardless of how much affected they've been, has been thrown into at least tier 2. If they can push the numbers down before Christmas, then maybe all the rampant granny hugging won't lead to a catastrophic surge, and then we can throw everyone back into lockdown immediately afterwards to damp down what there has been. If people tolerate it, and that's an open question because people are certainly not happy with the latest announcements, it will be because of the promise of a vaccine on the horizon. It'll all be over once the vaccine arrives. But will people take the vaccine? Research by the Vaccine Confidence Project found public trust in vaccines somewhat variable around the world, and that by and large sentiment is moving slowly against. They found that only 54% of UK respondents said that they would definitely get a COVID vaccine. And after viewing misinformation on social media, that number dropped to 48%. In October, a survey of 18,000 adults across 15 countries found that only 1 in 5 would want to get a vaccine immediately when it became available. In most countries, the majority would prefer to wait a few months. Almost 3 in 4 would, however, take it within a year, with the lowest intent in France at just over 50%. France, as you would expect from that figure, also has the highest percentage of those strongly opposed to taking it at all at 21%. The equivalent figure for the US is 15% and the UK at 8%. Globally, the percentage of people that would want to get a COVID-19 vaccine dropped around 4 percentage points between August and October. Now, some of that may be because of more spread of anti-vaccination content, although not necessarily all of it. The biggest drop, for instance, was in China. Given that China's been relatively infection-free compared to many other countries, that may be as much to do with perceived levels of risk as it is about the vaccine per se. Whereas in France, it's seen as strongly connected to general negativity towards the government. Of course, the way this is currently being discussed is that there's this self-evidently perfect solution, the vaccine, and it's only being undermined by stupid people, probably Trump supporters, who'd rather inject bleach or something. It's not quite that simple. And there are other voices being raised about the detail behind the vaccines and the risks of an accelerated process where people might be motivated not to look too closely. The AstraZeneca vaccine has been an early indicator of this since its trial produced what have been described as perplexing results. The AstraZeneca vaccine has been described as having a 70% effectiveness rate, or 90%, depending on the dosing. Basically, the trial suggested that an initial half dose, followed later by a full dose, would produce better results than 2 full doses. Now you may ask, how the heck did they find that out? And the answer, not wholly reassuringly, was that a subgroup of trial participants, around 2,700 people, were accidentally given the half dose. It wasn't a deliberate part of the trial. It's possible that this was only noticed because that group experienced milder side effects than the others that had received the full dose. None of them, by the way, were over the age of 55, so we don't know for sure that the boost in effectiveness works for the most vulnerable groups. This is why AstraZeneca has had to go on the defence somewhat in recent days, why its share price dipped by 6%, and why it's now looking at carrying out another global trial. When you do these things at speed, such messiness is rather likely to result. And it could be things like that erode the public appetite for vaccination more than it is seeing posters produced by Russia claiming that having a vaccine is going to turn you into a chimpanzee. Maybe. What about the other vaccines with the higher rates of effectiveness, the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines? Because their reported effectiveness rates are pretty astounding. Pfizer says it recorded 170 COVID-19 cases in 44,000 volunteers. 162 of those came in the placebo group. These trials always run with a group that's given what might have been the vaccine but isn't. Just 8 were in the group that actually got the vaccine. Moderna said 95 out of 30,000 volunteers got COVID-19, 90 in the placebo group, just 5 in the vaccine group. All of those who got the vaccine who then caught the COVID-19 were said to have gotten mild symptoms only. In an article in the British Medical Journal, Peter Doshi pointed out that these reports of 95% effectiveness rates weren't entirely what they seemed. He said this: "Let's put this in perspective. First, a relative risk reduction is being reported, not absolute risk reduction, which appears to be less than 1%. Second, these results refer to the trial's primary endpoint of COVID-19 of essentially any severity, and importantly not the vaccine's ability to save lives, nor the ability to prevent infection, nor the efficacy in important subgroups, e.g. frail elderly. Those still remain unknown. Third, these results reflect a time point relatively soon after vaccination, and we know nothing about vaccine performance at 3, 6 or 12 months, so cannot compare these efficacy numbers against other vaccines like influenza vaccines, which are judged over a season. And fourth, children, adolescents and immunocompromised individuals were largely excluded from the trials, so we still lack any data on these important populations. Doshi argued that the trial should have been more focused on areas such as the prevention of severe disease and transmission in high-risk groups. But he warned it's hard to avoid the impression that sponsors are claiming victory and wrapping up their trials, and the FDA will now be under enormous pressure to rapidly authorise the vaccines. Given such concerns, you would at least conclude that those people saying that they would wait a few months before agreeing to the vaccine, it's not an irrational response. Indeed, maybe that's why a poll has found almost half of doctors say they would not take a rushed vaccine. There will, however, be pressure, if not from governments, then from wider society. We've already heard from Qantas, for instance, that vaccination will be required to fly on their airline. All those people chafing under Tier 3 lockdown rules right now, being told they can't hug their grannies, it won't take many of the aspects of normality to require vaccination before they decide, hey, it's worth it to get back to a normal life. Now, in a minute, we'll take a quick look at some of the other things that happened this week, but first, in the UK, the Conservative government has committed to net zero carbon by 2050. Some in the party have reacted against this, saying that the government is captured by woke madness. It's straying away from its conservative roots. Now, whatever you do, someone's going to hate you for it. But are they right in this case? Is radical action on climate change against solid conservative principles? Should it indeed be lumped in with the critiques against so-called woke leftism? Whichever way you'd fall, you probably recognise that this is an important part of the debate. Conservative voices are easy to find raised against the extremists like Extinction Rebellion, who would give away all economic progress in the name of top-down government action on climate. But for some, that means opposing any action whatsoever and arguing that there's simply no problem. Do the Tories, or Republicans for that matter, have to reject their own political traditions in the name of climate change? What is the Conservative case for action on climate change? At a time when some people believe it's only the left that care about it, and it can only be a Trojan horse for left-wing big government programs, it's a more important discussion than ever. We'll be looking at this in detail in the next video. A conservative case for action on climate change. Coming at 7 PM UK time on Monday next week, 30th of November. Join me then. Joe Biden has been appointing people. Many of them are people who were part of the Obama administration, which has created some comment from Trump Republicans who hailed it as the return of a swamp. And it was viewed with equal disdain by some on the left, who saw Biden hiring in line with his positioning as a centrist and avoiding the radicals. One of the very first picks was former presidential candidate John Kerry, who was appointed to be Biden's climate czar. And so far the message has been going out that climate change will be a major focus, at least on the international stage. Biden reportedly discussed climate change cooperation with nearly all the world leaders who called to congratulate him on his win. John Kerry quickly tweeted out after his appointment this: "It'll be an honour to work with our allies and partners alongside rising young leaders in the climate movement to tackle the climate crisis with the seriousness and urgency it deserves." President Trump could also have justifiably been claimed to have been giving climate change the seriousness and urgency that he felt it deserved, but we'll take it as a given that the same phrase can mean two rather different things depending on the person saying it. It's worth noting that this position is embedded in the National Security Council. A lot of this is outward facing, seeking to fulfill Biden's stated aims to become a global climate leader. I think that's going to be tricky since the UK, the EU, China, Japan and South Korea have all signed up to net zero targets that they're starting to mobilise around. Whatever your skepticism of their chances of success, they have to be higher than the soon-to-be President Biden, who is almost certainly not going to have a friendly majority in the Senate, and so will be somewhat constrained to get anywhere close to matching the level ambitions that others have set. Not all of Biden's intended appointments have been acclaimed by his radical base or by environmentalists. Brian Deese is in the frame for the National Economic Council, but there's been a big kickback because he's a former managing director and head of sustainable development at BlackRock. The Sunrise campaign called for its members to send a clear message to Biden: no hires with terrible climate records. But does he have? High-profile environmental campaigner Bill McKibben doesn't think so. He did a tweet thread attesting to his personal experience with Deese, saying that he cares about the environment and he worked hard on advancing the issue, both in policy and then latterly at BlackRock. So it's nice that he was able to get that personal endorsement. What happens to people who happen to work at big corporates if they haven't personally come to the attention of someone like Bill McKibben? Well, that's another matter, obviously. Presumably, the general principle that you should jump to conclusions about people based on zero real information, that's not actually being challenged here. It's just that Bill happens to know that it doesn't apply in this case. So that's exciting. Of course, some people don't have to work at the likes of BlackRock to get people trying to cancel them. One thing that happened this week is that Professor Jordan Peterson announced his new book, which will be published early next year. The publisher held a town hall meeting about it. We were soon hearing stories that some of the young woke staffers at Penguin Random House were up in arms. It was reported by Vice that people were crying at this meeting about how Jordan Peterson had affected their lives. One said that Peterson had radicalised her father, and another suggested that publishing the book would negatively affect her non-binary friend. A junior employee was quoted by Vice as saying, "He is an icon of hate speech and transphobia, and the fact that he's an icon of white supremacy, regardless of the content of his book, I'm not proud to work for a company that publishes him." Ah yes, this is an employee who's clearly suited to the publishing industry. Never mind what he actually says in his books. My friends on Twitter say he's an icon of white supremacy, so he shouldn't be published. Penguin, it was quickly pointed out, also publishes Mein Kampf by Adolf Hitler. That apparently hadn't unduly troubled these youngsters. Jordan Peterson, though, well, now you're talking real evil, regardless of what he actually says in his books. Another employee complained, the company since June has been doing all these anti-racist and allyship things, and them publishing Peterson's book completely goes against this. It just makes all their previous efforts seem completely performative. Maybe they were. Although maybe they know what you refuse to see, that Jordan Peterson is in no way a racist, and his work, written and on YouTube, has helped an enormous number of young men who were struggling with all sorts of problems and identity issues, and maybe even your dad come to that. If you could bring yourself to have a conversation that didn't start with words like, I can't believe you like that racist off YouTube. Whether that is how the bosses of Penguin Random House see it or not isn't wholly clear. They made the following statement. We announced yesterday that we will publish Jordan Peterson's new book, Beyond Order, this coming March. Immediately following the announcement, we held a forum and provided a space for our employees to express their views and offer feedback. Our employees have started an anonymous feedback channel, which we fully support. We are open to hearing our employees' feedback and answering all of their questions. We remain committed to publishing a range of voices and viewpoints. If I was Jordan Peterson, I'm not sure I would read that and take away that it was wholly an expression of fulsome support for their author. You could easily read it saying, even if he is a scumbag, we're committed to publishing a wide range of voices. But then, on second thoughts, maybe that actually is the right position. They shouldn't need to defend their authors against the political opinions of their staff. They should just say, we don't publish only people that you approve of. Of course, it's easy to laugh at this, as youngsters discover that, well, no, publishers are not going to cancel the top authors who sell millions of books. Young staffers, whether woke or not, are relatively easy to replace. Million-selling authors are not. So J.K. Rowling and Jordan Peterson need not worry unduly. But of course the point is, it's the latest example of how these censorship-minded political activists are filling the workplaces of all of these spaces. Newspapers, publishers, podcast producers, and thinking that their opinions should affect who gets platformed. Usually it won't be Jordan Peterson or J.K. Rowling, it'll be smaller authors who don't have the same sort of protection. And some of whom we've already seen being pushed out by the outrage mobs that don't care what you actually wrote, they just know that you're a bigot. In other news, former poet laureate Ted Hughes was named by the British Library as having been a massive racist. Turns out he kept slaves. When I say he kept slaves, I mean his ancestor kept slaves. So he benefited indirectly from them from 400 years ago. Well, when I say his ancestor kept them, actually it was Nicholas Farrar who died childless, so he wasn't technically an ancestor at all. And in other news, the British Library has apologised to the widow of Ted Hughes for implying that he was a massive racist with no justifiable foundation at all. Meanwhile, the search for other sinners goes on. In a minute, we'll answer a couple of comments and have the final thought for the week. But first, the Wednesday video next week will be a Q&A. People who support the channel on Patreon have been asked to provide questions. Those have started to come in. If you have a burning question you'd like to have discussed, by all means add it in the comment section below, preceded by the word question. Patron questions will get priority, but if there's something that will be particularly interesting to talk about, I will try to include it if I can. Either way, hopefully we'll get to cover a number of interesting topics from all of these various things we've been discussing for the last few months. That video will be going live 7 PM UK time on Wednesday next week, the 2nd of December. I hope you'll join me then. This week, the video on why climate scientists lose debates got an interesting range of reactions, mostly from a host of climate skeptic commenters who simply couldn't get their head around the idea that I'd done a video that showed climate scientists losing the debate when they're convinced, in spite of all the content that I put on here, that I'm practically Al Gore. They were looking for, there must be subliminal messaging I put in to rubbish their side. I had people jumping on how I described the teams. Climate scientists versus climate skeptics. How dare you, they said. What's Richard Lindzen if not a climate scientist? Indeed, which is why I introduced him as an atmospheric physicist. But there were 3 climate scientists on one team. It's what they had in common. Whereas the other team's members, what they had in common was that they would all happily have described themselves as climate skeptics. Then there was this one about Michael Crichton. So, having earned an MD from Harvard, he is in your estimation a writer and not a scientist. Yes, indeed. Do you know how I know he was a writer? He wrote books. Highly successful ones by all accounts. Do you think he might at some point have described himself as a writer? Check out his official website and see for yourself. It's only in your head that there was a hierarchy there anyway. I didn't make value judgments. I didn't go into anyone's credentials. It wasn't the point of the video. It was about types of argument and debating technique. Some people couldn't bring themselves to watch something like that without simply wanting to relive the debate and crush the competition. The other video this week was on irreversible damage by Abigail Shrier. Lots of supportive comments on that one, thank you. But also a significant minority who couldn't let go of the previous one. Here's an example. In my mind, this topic and climate change, all caps, are identical, all caps. Perhaps this statement will help you understand us as a group. We are trans deniers. We are climate change deniers. You can call us the realistic group. Nah. If you say, here's an issue, and we're against what that group say about it, and here's another issue, and we're against what that group say about it again, that's a consistent position, but only one that makes you right so long as the other side is wrong. Instead, you could follow the research and the evidence, the science. The evidence shows that sex is binary and that the standard gender dysphoria expresses itself in certain ways. The other group get the gender unicorn to preach a different version that someone literally made up. It has no basis in research. The evidence also shows that the planet is warming, and various supporting data shows it to be highly likely this is coming from human-caused CO2. The other group claim that a worldwide conspiracy of scientists are faking the figures, or that it's sunspots, or any one of a dozen alternatives, and that's a tell as well, by the way. Look, our understanding of the science can change on any of these things. I am always interested in new evidence and arguments. But you need something better than gender unicorns or scientists making up the figures. Last week there was a viral tweet from a nurse. You probably saw it. It said this: I have a night off from the hospital. I can't help but think of the COVID patients the last few days. The ones that stick out are those who still don't believe the virus is real. The ones who scream at you for a magic medicine and that Joe Biden is going to ruin the USA, all while gasping for breath on 100% Vapotherm. They tell you there must be another reason they are sick. They call you names and ask why you have to wear all that stuff because they don't have COVID, because it's not real. Yes, this really happens. Does it though? Does it really? Because it sounds a little too neatly fitting into a political stereotype, which is exactly why it went viral, of course, and how she ended up on CNN telling the story to the widest audience on one side of a political divide that would find that story affirming. David Zweig, writing for Wired, was suspicious. Her account was that this was happening constantly, numerous times each day. So that would have to be part of a wider phenomenon. So he spoke to other nurses in similar settings. None of them had experienced such a thing. He called hospitals in the same part of South Dakota. Same response. Most patients are grateful and thankful for our help, one told him. I have not experienced this, nor have I been told of this experience ever. Now, maybe that nurse was lying. Maybe she was unlucky and unrepresentative. Either way, the story spread far and wide because certain people wanted to believe it, because it fitted a narrative. Both sides are prone to do that, by the way, for the stories that fit. That, therefore, comes down to social norms of behaviour. If we keep spreading the things that happen to mirror the reality in which we want to believe, without checking, we will perpetuate this gap in perceptions of reality. And always look further, including to what I've just told you now, because you know what? Such things may not be so far away after all. Maybe not in South Dakota. In Italy, doctors are increasingly getting abused. Windows of their cars getting smashed, murals honouring their work defaced, one doctor was beaten up. In Turin, ambulance workers were confronted by a yelling couple claiming that the virus doesn't exist. Social media has seen people sneaking into hospitals, shooting footage in empty wards and claiming falsely that they're the COVID wards, and it's all made up. Actively, deliberately gaslighting a nation with fake videos. So if you think it couldn't happen like it's claimed in South Dakota, think again. These are all the real life consequences of a world that doesn't know what is or is not real anymore. That is something we really need to work on. Now, one thing that surprised me this week is that the review of Irreversible Damage by Abigail Shrier didn't get demonetised. I was totally sure it would do. Indeed, possibly a lot worse, given how people have responded to the book. Anything could still happen, of course. So far, crickets. It's worth noting it would have been very easy to self-censor and decide not to go there because of what might have been expected to be the consequences. And this is the danger of these situations with cancel culture and all of that. Not just the few who get the high-profile cancellings, but all the people who self-censor just in case. Luckily, the support of good people on Patreon means that I can and will continue to make videos on all the subjects that I think are important, regardless of whether they're likely to get demonetised or not. It enables me to put in the time it takes to produce 3 videos or more per week as well, even though a number of them require quite a lot of time and research. So if you would like to add your support for the independent, fact-focused and non-ideological content that I aim to produce here, please consider signing up at patreon.com/Mallen Baker. It is always appreciated. Either way, have a great week. My name's Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show.